Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about one of literary's great spies, so if that sounds interesting, hang around and listen to a novel review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, A Novel Review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect and explore the wonderful world of literature, and the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle, so let's start making our way through, one book at a time. The name's Bond. James Bond. No, it's not. It is Seamus. This is a novel review, a book podcast, and if you hadn't guessed it, today I am going to be talking about James Bond Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, the first of the James Bond books, which is kind of fun. But before I talk about that, I always take a moment to reflect on any mantelpiece moments, something to highlight from the week past. And this past week, I went to well, I call it a car boot sale. That's what it's called in Australia. I think it's the same here, a car boot sale, like a secondhand market kind of thing. I hope it's called the same here or around the world. I'd never actually considered that. Car boot sale, you're selling stuff out of your car boot. Anyways, I went to one and there was a guy selling some books. So naturally I had a bit of a rifle and I saw James Bond Casino Royale and I kind of looked at it and thought, yeah, like I've never once considered reading the books. For no particular reason other than I just never come across one really. I've never seen one in a bookshop, never seen one in a secondhand bookshop. So when I saw that, I was like, yeah, I could give that a read. And I went to pay and the guy was like, it's actually £3 for £1. And I was like, oh, I didn't actually need 3 books. And there was nothing there that was really piquing my interest from my sort of very quick glance. So I went back and had another very quick glance and I managed to find 2 more books to purchase, which, yeah, like I wasn't trying to do. Happy accident, we'll say. I found Poirot Investigates by Agatha Christie. Love a Poirot. Done 2 episodes already on this podcast. And this is a book that appears to be sort of, I think it was 12 shorter stories. 11 shorter stories. Which is kind of cool because I'd never seen that before in my life. I didn't realize that she'd also done sort of smaller, shorter cases as well. So I'll get to that eventually. And then unfortunately there was no other book that I really wanted. So I picked up this one just because I had to make up the numbers pretty much. I'll be brutally honest. From the City, from the Plough by Alexander Barron. Never heard of the book, never heard of the author. I think he is one that has fallen to the turned pages of history. So yeah, if you've ever heard of him or this book, please reach out and let me know if it's actually worth a read, because at the moment it's sitting on the pile of books that I will probably just donate back to a secondhand shop. These 2 is definitely staying with me. James Bond doesn't technically have to stay with me because I've read it now and I'm about to do an episode on it, so we will get there in a second. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, that would be absolutely fantastic. If you'd like to give me a 5-star review, that would be just as fantastic. I would really appreciate it. So yeah. Please don't feel the need. It's a free podcast. Just sit back and enjoy the show. Okay, let's get into the book. James Bond Casino Royale, Ian Fleming. I should have actually checked this before I started the episode, what year it came out. First printing, 1953. So I'm going to say it very much reads like a book from 1953 in a few different elements. I'll get to that in a second. Basically, I just wanted to know if it holds up. If it holds up as a book that is still, a good book. As I said, I'd never seen it in bookshops. I've never seen it in a secondhand bookshop. I'm assuming most people listening to this will have seen at least one of the films. This is, of course, the first one, Casino Royale, was at 2007 with Daniel Craig, the first showing of Daniel Craig as James Bond. So a pretty prominent moment in my James Bond watching career. Not that I'm a super fan or anything like that, but I think I was 13 at the time and I'd watched a couple of Pierce Brosnan ones growing up, but they'd never really stuck because I guess I was so young. And then watching Casino Royale at 13, I was like, oh, this is pretty cool, and went to watch the rest of them and then obviously seen the book, thought, yep, let's give it a read. So does it hold up? I'm going to say yes and no. I'm going to say no, it definitely does not hold up in the fact that James Bond is quite sexist and quite racist to a degree. So definitely doesn't hold up on that aspect. Definitely reads as a book from 1953. Obviously, that's post-World War II. There's a lot of anxiety, but that does not excuse treating women poorly and other races poorly as well. James Bond is, I'm going to say, I think he's sort of always portrayed in the films as this really sort of charismatic, really likable character. But in the book, I think he read a lot more as a really cold-hearted wanker, to be quite honest. And that's not something that really deterred me because, I mean, he's a spy that is paid to kill people. So the fact that he's an unlikable person wasn't really a surprise. The fact that he is quite rude to women and calls them bitches and stuff like that just is not a surprise. The fact that he's racist to other people, I mean, he's a spy. He's obviously incredibly patriotic to England, which at the time is, you know, it's all about, I was about to say king and country, queen and country and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't that much of a surprise to pick up a book from the 50s and go, yep, there's a bit of sexism and racism in here. So it definitely doesn't hold up on that part, but it does hold up in the fact that it is a pretty good story. It's very readable. So yeah, it's a page turner. It's an easy book. It's very easy to read. It's like 180 pages. The chapters are incredibly short. I'll get to that in a second. What I loved most, I think, about this book was coming into it, again, watching the films, they're kind of just like action films, and you kind of, I think, at least I did, just kind of brush over the general storylines. You're kind of there just to see like an Aston Martin and a cocktail being shaken and James Bond to pull off some cool stunts and stuff like that. Reading the book, it really kind of highlighted to me how ridiculous this storyline is, how just absurd the entire story is, but the particular storyline with Le Chiffre and the casino itself. What I found was this is definitely less a spy novel and much more kind of like a low fantasy novel because it's just absolutely insane. And I think that's one of the most wonderfully fun and charming aspects of it because I guess to do a brief overview, Le Chiffre is the chief villain of this story and he is kind of incredibly poor at this stage because he's taken out, he owes like a lot of people money and his only way to get money back is by gambling. And the British government, or the British Secret Service, I should say, decides that they can't really kill him because that would turn him into a martyr. So their only logical course of action is to send in a secret agent who also just happens to be an absolute whiz at gambling, and their plan is to gamble him out of money, thus saving the day. And I mean, that is just absolutely insane. It's the most ridiculous, ludicrous, insane storyline, and I absolutely loved it. I'm going to read for you the first paragraph. It's only 4 lines, and it just sort of, I think, really captures the scene setting. It sets up the story really nicely, but it also captures Ian Fleming's writing style, and I think he's a pretty good writer. So this is how the opening paragraph goes. The scent and smoke of a casino are nauseating at 3 in the morning. Then the soul erosion produced by high gambling, a compost of greed and fear and nervous tension, become unbearable, and the senses awake and revolt from it. James Bond suddenly knew that he was tired. He always knew when his body or his mind had had enough, and he always acted on the knowledge. This helped him to avoid staleness and the sensual bluntness that breeds mistakes. I read a bit more than the first few lines because it's just so readable and it's actually really nice. And I mean, the scent and smoke and sweat of casino are nauseating. That is just lovely. A compost of greed and fear and nervous tension. I mean, that is just delightful. Okay, so beyond that, what did I like about the book? What I found enjoyed about this book was you do, as it's the first one, you get quite a bit of, I'm not going to say backstory into James Bond's character, but you do get some sort of insights into how he conducts himself on a daily manner. I think it's the first or the second chapter. He returns to his hotel room expecting it to have been broken into, but it hasn't been broken into, and he's got these little checks that he goes through, and it's all very, like, I don't know, I'm not a spy and I'm not from the 50s, and I'm sure it's changed a lot in this time, but it all seems very, I'm going to say like comic book spy level kind of stuff, like he's draped a hair over a drawer kind of thing, and he's seeing if that's been sort of knocked out of place, and a certain stuff like that, just stuff like that where you're like, that just seems low level spy stuff. that's exactly how it could have been in the 50s. I don't know. I'm not a spy, so that might have been the precautions that they had to take and still might have to take, because even though it seems incredibly childish, it's, I guess, a relatively effective and simple and small and quiet and subtle way to check if someone's been in your room. So we run through that and we sort of get an idea of what James Bond is like as a character, and he's incredibly meticulous. He's, you know, described as cold-hearted. He's incredibly meticulous. He's just very thorough in the way he conducts himself. But then you also get some other, I'm going to say, it made me think of him as a more human character, some more humanistic traits, and that's when he's talking about why he sort of loves food and drink as much as he does and these kind of earthly pleasures. And it's because, you know, in this job, there's obviously not a lot of room for emotion, and if there is room for emotion, you're probably going to get hurt or someone's going to use it against you. So because of that, he kind of like indulges in food and drink, and I think it was incredibly small, but an incredibly subtle way to insert that into the story. But I think it was incredibly effective, because you always read these books and you're like, oh, of course he knows how to gamble perfectly. Of course he knows how to mix a drink perfectly and knows, you know, one of the most famous cocktails in literature is from this book. It's the Vesper cocktail, the Vesper martini, which is, oh no, what is it? 3 measures of Gordon, 1 measure of vodka, half a measure of Kinder Lillet, shaken, not stirred, and then a big thin lemon slice. But it's these kind of things like, how does he know how to just create the perfect cocktail and indulge in all these foods? And then he sort of explains that, yeah, because I'm alone so much, I basically want to take control of the things that I can control, and that is my food. And through that, I derive pleasure outside of the job itself. And it actually kind of made me more, made me think of him as more of a human being than just this robot that he's kind of described as, because he likes to indulge in certain things that he just knows. I mean, it maybe not made me think of him more human, made me respect him more as a person, despite the fact that he is a sexist, racist, bit of a pig in this book. But I guess, you know, just in this last week, there was the news article of the Russian family returning back to Russia, and the kids, they had kids that one of the girls looked like 12 years old, and she's now returning back to Russia. She didn't even know she was Russian. She doesn't speak any Russian. She spoke Spanish. Where were they living? Slovenia, I think it was. And it's just like, to be an undercover spy and have, I guess, emotional attachments can be incredibly destructive. And I mean, those kids are going to now grow up. Like if my parents at 12 years old thrust me out of my life in suburban Sydney and was like, no, we're actually Russian, I'd be like, what the fuck? You know, like I'm going to have such intense trust issues. I can't look at you as my parents now. I'm just like things that you've carried around with you and treated like shit my entire life. So I think I gained a bit of respect for him for like recognizing that emotional attachments is going to be destructive to him and the other person, and therefore he derives his pleasure from alcohol and drinks and cigarettes, which he smokes 70 of a day, which is absolutely foul. I mean, the scent of just like his hair and fingers must just be absolutely disgusting. But I think it was just that little moment that I was kind of like, oh, like he's acutely aware that his job is unusual and destructive, and actually tries to control that and therefore like seek pleasure through other things in his life that isn't necessarily hurtful to other people. I definitely got to caveat that by saying he spends half this book kind of hating Vesper Lynd for being a woman, and then the other half of the book trying to sleep with her. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. He's definitely not a saint in this. I'm not trying to say he's the most perfect character that understands his destructive behaviors, because he definitely wants to and tries to and actively sleeps with women that always happen to be absolutely stunning, which is probably why I think it's a bit of a fantasy novel. So something about this book that probably detracted me a bit but didn't detract me at all was they're not actually playing, in the film they're playing poker. In this they're playing baccarat, which I've never seen played live. I've been to a casino a handful of times, but I've never seen it live. I, to this day, don't know what the rules are. There's actually an entire chapter pretty much dedicated to James Bond explaining the rules, and that was probably, I guess, maybe the most boring chapter of the book, mostly because I didn't really care how baccarat was played. I wasn't that invested in the game, I guess. Maybe if it was something like poker, something that I already knew and understood and know that they still actively play, at least in Australian casinos that I never go to, I might have taken a bit more of an interest, but they didn't. And I just don't really care about baccarat, but that didn't really detract me from the story because I don't think it's a major plot point. The rules of baccarat, all you got to know is James Bond winning or is he losing? And they're always pretty, Ian Fleming's always pretty sort of straightforward, whether he's winning or losing. And I think that that's probably good enough. Because like I've heard of baccarat, but I've just never seen it played, and I would have no idea how it's played. I have no idea what the pieces are, what's involved. I Googled it just before this episode, and like this guy had like this long paddle, and I was like, wow, if James Bond spoke about that, it was just like straight over the head. So that was probably the thing that could detract you from this book a bit, is if you don't know. But as someone that doesn't know and took no notice of it, it was absolutely fine. I didn't really care. I'm a spectator in this. I'm the reader. I didn't care how the game was played. And I think one of the reasons I didn't care how baccarat was played was just because the general pacing of the book is really nice, actually. It's really swift. Like I said, it's about 180 pages. The chapters are never too long. They always seem to be 4 to 6 pages long. So you're never in something too long. And a lot of the chapters do relate and do continue straight into the next chapter, but I guess it's just that mental sort of break that a chapter gives you. You know, you get to the end of a chapter, you feel you can stop and sort of decompress and step away for a second if you need to, but you do have the option to continue. So it's an incredibly swift book. It moves along quite steadily. You know, the first chapter we're thrust straight into the casino, then we go back and get a bit of backstory, and then it's just like full guns are blazing. We are at the casino gambling, and then the story progresses from there. So I thought the pacing was actually really nice to this book. You know, it's incredibly readable. It's incredibly digestible. It's not overwritten. There's not long passages where you're like, God, this is terrible. Maybe the one baccarat chapter, but again, that's neither here nor there. And then I think what I found absolutely, I guess, fascinating from a book like this was how, just given coming into it and reading up until this stage, how much of a, like I said, he's sexist, he's racist. He seems like he just is typifying a certain person from this era that seems to be, we're fighting for Queen and country and therefore we are the good guys, and that is it. But there's actually a lot more nuance to the story that actually really took me by surprise, and I was going to read you a little section. So this is James Bond in the story. If you have seen the film, you'll know this. If you have not seen the film or read the book, James Bond gets caught and tortured for a long time, and it's a incredibly brutal kind of torture. It's a torture that involves a very large rope sort of tied into a knot, swinging up a chair into his genitalia. So it's incredibly painful. But he's tortured for a long time, and you get the sense that this is the first time James Bond has been caught and tortured, because he kind of has this awakening from it. And I'm going to read you this little bit about sort of who's the hero and who's the villain. So the quote starts with James actually detailing a bit of his backstory. He's at this stage in hospital recovering from being tortured, and he's having this kind of awakening talking to a character called Mathis. And he goes into a bit of backstory how he got his 00. He says, for those 2 jobs, I was awarded a 00 number in the service. Felt pretty clever and got a reputation for being good and tough. A 00 number in our service means you've had to kill a chap in cold blood in the course of some job. So this is the quote I wanted to read you now. I just wanted to give you that bit of backstory. He says, now, he looked up again at Mathis, that's all very fine. The hero kills 2 villains, but when the hero-less chief starts to kill the villain Bond, and the villain Bond knows he isn't a villain at all, you see the other side of the medal. The villains and heroes get all mixed up. Of course, he added as Mathis started to expostulate, patriotism comes along and makes it all seem fairly all right. But this country right or wrong business is getting a little out of date. Today we are fighting communism. Okay, if I'd been alive 50 years ago, the brand of conservatism we have today would have been damn near called communism, and we should have been told to go off and fight that. History is moving pretty quickly these days, and the heroes and villains keep on changing parts. And I think it was just this wonderful quote that pretty much came out of nowhere, I felt, that really just kind of like, he's recognizing that he doesn't necessarily think he's the hero of this story, or that we should think of him as the hero of this story. He's just the main character, and we're just reading one side of the story. That's not to say I think Le Chiffre was a particularly good character and didn't deserve what he got in this book, but it's James kind of coming to this realization that he's not on necessarily the good side, he's just on the winning side, which I thought was actually like a really nice little nugget to get from a book from the 50s. I thought it was really well. Something else I really loved is James, after he's tortured, it takes, I think, 3 weeks for him to recover from his injuries. He is not this superhero that he has sort of become in the films that can just leap from tall buildings and survive whatever. No, he's kind of like, I was tortured for 1 hour and it took 3 weeks to recover from, and I had a mental awakening as a result of it. So it was like a pretty big deal. Like this 1 hour of torture just led to this complete change in him, and he actually tries to leave the service. And of course, there's a beautiful twist ending that I think was absolutely perfect, because you read it and then it's a twist ending. For anyone that's seen the film or of course read the book, it's a wonderful, very good twist that I think then thrusts you deeper into the world of the spies and definitely makes you want to read book 2. So that was James Bond Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. Look, I'm going to rate this a 3.8 out of 5. I think it was a very readable, a lot of fun, can easily smash it in a weekend. I would recommend it for that. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week I have started reading a book called Call Me Stan, A Tragedy in 3 Millennia by K.R. Wilson. The author actually sent me this book and I've started reading it. I am 162 pages in. I'm absolutely smashing through this book. It is about a guy called Stan, and basically Stan has this wonderfully terrible thing about him in that he cannot die. He still can suffer pain. He still feels hungry. So it's incredibly annoying for that sense. He can't just like go out and explore the world. He still has to participate in society. And I think the participation in society at this stage is just a wonderful thing, because it starts a very long time ago. And so far, what have we seen? We've seen the creation of Norse mythology. We've seen the destruction of Troy. So, I mean, it's kind of this character that's sort of sweeping through history, and he seems to always be at these wonderfully large plot points in history without it feeling too forced as well. And I think that's important, is it doesn't feel like Stan just magically pops up at these different points. It seems to be a very natural sort of slide to these moments, and I'm really enjoying it. 400 pages, I think. So yeah, 162 in, still plenty to go, which is fantastic because we're not that far into history yet. So absolutely enjoying that. Would recommend. Okay, I think it's time to end this episode. But first, please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I really appreciate it. You can also head along to the website and support the pod in other ways. But as always, just thank you for your attention. So yeah, I think it's time to end this episode. And today, to take us away, a bit of Ivan Turgenev and this lovely little line. Could he be born from the start, if only for a fleeting moment, to be so dear to your heart?